In Chapter 2 of the book, your students are going to be asked to use Google Trends to be able to focus on and identify patterns or behaviors of search data that they can correlate and come up with some conclusions as to why they believe there were some relationships between those search terms. So one of the search terms that your students are going to be asked to actually look for is earthquake. Well, in Google Trend Search, when I search for the word earthquake, what I'm not finding is the result of what search term I'm looking for, but rather what I find is the frequency of interest over time on a scale maximum of 100. All of the other peaks and troughs you'll see here are relative to that scale. And so one of the first things that's important is for students to be able to use this to identify key events that occurred. So March 2011, there was a tremendous amount of searching on the word earthquake. So if I type into a normal Google search, March 2011 earthquake, you see why. This was the Japan earthquake that caused, there's another keyword here that as a student I may see megaquake, but I also see tsunami appearing. So let me go back as a student and add a search term. The great thing about the Google Trend search is that I can add as many terms as I want, and what they will do is, as you can see here, they will overlay on top of one another. And so identifiably you can see the peaks and troughs match up exactly with one another on many of the most epic of events. And so as you're thinking about using this activity with your students, consider what we're asking students to do. Are we asking them simply to search words and see which ones have the same peaks and troughs? No, we're asking them to use higher order thinking skills. And with those higher order thinking skills, come up with conclusions as to why we may see the term tsunami and earthquake correlated to one another. So some examples that you might also try, given the fact that we're looking at solar events, is if I add a search term, let's say solar flare, same activity. I could go to March of 2012, almost a year after the earthquake in Japan, and I could search in the same fashion, March 2012, but this time I'm going to search for solar flare, and I see here it's the largest solar flare in 5 years. Geomagnetic storm is something that's critical here. Okay, scrolling down I can see a lot of different keywords. But what you may want to ask your students to do is identify what other things tend to follow or to correlate with the incident of a solar flare. Well, we know that the northern lights, the aurora, also has an impact. Take a look at that. As we see the northern lights search, we see it matches quite well with many of the peaks. If I search for aurora, we may find the same type of thing. The risk that you run here is that when searching for aurora, you may actually end up with somebody looking for an automobile that happens to have that same name. So you do have to understand that in Google Trends search with your students, it is not necessarily contextual to what it is your students think they're searching for. It's actually returning the search results for how many times relative to the peak and the minimum, the troughs, that search term was used, not relative to the context that you're trying to hopefully discover with it. One thing you may also want to point out is that it only comes back to about 2004. Well, if you think about this, that's when Google was beginning the collection of all of this data that we've talked about, the idea of big data. The other thing that you'll see here is that certain terms, if there is a relatively consistent pattern of reoccurrence, you can see that there is a forecast button that you could actually use with your students to use the predictive analytics that Google provides, showing that March appears to be a peak time for northern lights. And you could actually go into the idea of the solar cycle and why that might be that you see these patterns in nature, and maybe it turns out it's a non-pattern, but Google attempts to make those forecasts when it sees in its algorithms the patterns and trends that are occurring across the searchers of certain key terms across its Google Analytics and its Google tools. So hopefully this gives you some background on how Google Trends works and how to really focus with your students, not just on searching the terms and seeing that they have similar patterns, but tying those patterns to an actual then real Google search to identify what events may have caused the peaks and troughs, as well as the most important piece of using those higher order thinking skills to be able to analyze with your students why those patterns are revealed through the Google Trend search.